Welcome to episode 3 of the Mr. McMahon Netflix documentary review show, where myself and the man called Dave will talk about the screw job episode. But what is not a screw job is Game Up Hard Hydration. It's like your favorite seltzer, your favorite sports drink. Got together, had a baby, put a little alcohol in it, but it's so much better. They have sponsored 2024, and we want to give them as big a shout out as we can because they've got 4 big flavors. Hit it, Dave.
We're talking fruit punch, we're talking orange, we're talking lemon lime, and everybody's favorite grape. And guys, it's only 110 calories. It's a low carb drink, so you don't even have to feel guilty drinking it. Enjoy yourself some Game Up and enjoy what we're about to talk about today.
Mr. McMahon, this is the 3rd episode of the Netflix documentary titled Screw Job, and it starts off talking about the Wendy Richter screw job. Now, did you remember this? Had you heard a lot about this before this documentary?
I knew about the Wendy Richter screw job with the Spider Lady, and I didn't quite know what was going on as a kid. Just that Mua had dressed as the Spider Lady and, won the title. I remember thinking the pin looked awkward, but I didn't quite understand what was happening until years later when I found out there was a screw job, because I had forgotten about it, honestly. But yeah, I was well aware of that situation. It was interesting to go back, though, and hear Vince talk about it so candidly and seeing some of the old video of that match. Now, that being said, this is one of the few things with Vince where it's a little different what we're going to see, like at the end of the episode where we talk about with Bret Hart. Wendy Richter didn't have any creative control or anything. And if we taking Vince's word with a grain of salt here, it does sound like she was just trying to, I don't want to drop the title. And that does put the promoter in an awkward position. And like he said, I'm writing the script. This isn't actually your championship. I can almost kind of relate with that. There's very few things on this documentary where I'm going to be like, oh, okay, like we're going to talk about it later. He says some pretty hypocritical shit here. But in this particular instance, like I kind of get like, okay, well, what do you do in this situation?
Yeah, and if you think about it, back when his dad ran the company, he would tell people when they're gaining the championship, when they're going to lose it. Bob Backlund's book does a good job of explaining that. And we've heard champions like superstar Billy Graham thought he should have had a bigger run. Hogan thought he should have had a bigger run. That's kind of the natural tendency with champions. What's interesting is how he describes the championship. It's sentiments that get echoed later when he's talking about Bret, saying the championship is his, not theirs. Vince didn't care how people viewed the situation. What I thought was kind of tricky was just Vince describing it as, I remember Wendy Richter getting problematic. And could it be a champion thing? Could there be deeper issues? Now I think with the whole lawsuit coming out, people might wonder, did that play into it? I'm trying to think. There were other parallels I was seeing here. Oh, think about, and this is just kind of how Vince was. Remember, he got the commentary job when the commentator wanted more money from his dad, and his dad just made that quick business decision and put Vince in that spot. And this segment ended with, there's nothing I wouldn't do for our business. And I think that almost, with some other ways that Vince has described later, that almost becomes like one of those linchpin sentences for this episode.
That is the point of this. Vince McMahon has said before, and he says in his documentary, and other people have said it about him, there is nothing he wouldn't do for business.
Definitely. Now the next this really kind of kicks off where the last episode left off, with Hogan testifying at the steroid trial. The question you kind of led with was, did Hogan lie on the stand, or did the government just have certain expectations about what Hogan was going to say?
I mean, unless you know a little more about this, judging by the documentary, it doesn't seem like Hogan lied in the sense that, it doesn't sound like Vince ever outright told him to take steroids or ever sold him steroids. I mean, all the wrestlers, Tony Atlas and everything, kind of concur with that statement, that Vince never did that. That being said, Bret Hart puts it best too, is like, we were never told, we were never sold steroids. That being said, common sense would dictate all the top guys were using steroids that were getting pushed, so you kind of had to figure it out.
I really agreed with that. When he said that, I'm like, that kind of puts it perfectly, because, Vince didn't tell anybody. But I think what he definitely did do was didn't stop the culture.
Sure.
So he didn't tell people to do it, but he didn't disallow it until like it really became a problem. There weren't really brakes put on it. So I could see it as something he permitted, but didn't necessarily do. Like, he's not guilty exactly, but I mean, his hands could be slightly dirty.
Dave Meltzer, I thought, actually put it well here when he said that Linda McMahon said, this proves we don't have a steroid problem. He's like, no, this proves you did have a steroid problem. It just proved that Vince wasn't guilty of what they were trying to get him for. He said this trial proved that Vince wasn't really a good guy, and this didn't make him look like a good guy. He said, but if you want to write a column about him not being a good guy, you can do that. But if you're trying to convict him of something, you need a little more evidence than what they had. So I think that's at the end of the day. I think you hit it best when you just said that. Like there was a steroid problem. He wasn't doing anything to fix it, but he wasn't guilty of what they were trying to charge him with.
Now, Vince talks about feeling attacked by these bastards, as I believe he put it. And I believe this made Vince hate the federal government. So kind of two questions. Does Vince feel right to be attacked? And do you think this kind of tipped the scales towards his hatred of the government, or is just that his natural kind of hatred of establishment and of authority?
I think it probably just fired up something that was already there. Vince is a guy, he's a disruptor. We hear about disruptors all the time. And he said he loves confrontation. He doesn't want to be told what to do. So there's no way that he was ever really going to be a fan of the federal government. But them coming after him, I'm sure just made him hate them that much more. Was it justified? I mean, fuck, who knows? I mean, that's kind of harder to get into because, I mean, at the end of the day, this guy's done plenty wrong and got away with a lot, it would appear. So, I'm sure in his head he's justified.
And up until currently, like, he's gotten away with most things he's been accused of. Yeah. Now, one thing about Vince is he definitely views himself as the underdog. It comes up more later. But when you see things about, like, him getting mad that people are writing articles about him, when the subjects that are being written about definitely deserve to be talked about, something like this, it's at least worth an investigation. And Vince feels attacked in that way. We're going to talk later where he feels attacked again when it's something just in the course of business. So I think in his mind, he doesn't view himself as, I mean, in one way he does as rich and powerful, but he kind of always feels like, he doesn't feel like a rich person. We've heard it before. He feels basically like an underdog.
And he's definitely, but that's also, so we'll get to, that's Vince also trying to paint that picture a lot of times when it suits him, I believe, as the underdog. But maybe that's just what he believes too.
Yes. Now, another, like, it's not too often that as far as WWF business in this documentary, you hear about, like, many dips that they take. But this was definitely a time they talk about the cutbacks and WWF's struggle time looking to replace Hulk, because they're coming out of the steroids. They're changing up who they feature in that top spot. And we saw the Lex Express, the Lex Luger run. I remember that time period, and I was excited for Lex Luger. It was a little weird that he went from heel to this big baby face, but you're gonna have him body slam Yokozuna on a boat in a harbor. I am down for it. The Lex Express I thought was cool at the time. Now, knowing how much he hated it, it feels like a wild idea and kind of a weird swing and a miss for a company that usually knocks it out of the park with ideas.
Bruce Pritchard, I remember, talked about this on his podcast and how Lex didn't really embrace this. And that, if this had been Undertaker or someone, like, he would have really embraced this and really would have come up with something. But Lex really didn't want to be there. And you could see that the whole time. And that was one of the issues with this. That's according to Bruce. But I saw a clip of an interview Lex did with Conrad Thompson talking about the Lex Express. And he said, my biggest issue is, he says, I didn't get paid to do it. He said, they took me off the road. And he said, back then, if you didn't work, you didn't get paid. So that was the least amount of money I've ever made in my career. So that's why I didn't enjoy doing it. And this, that's very understandable. Like, I can see where you're not going to be happy to do this like all the time. Maybe it was like a one-time, deal. You do a couple spots, but if you're doing it the whole summer and you're not making any money, I can see that's.
Yeah, 100%. And if you think about at that time period, I mean, we saw them try and go from Hogan to Warrior, and then they went back to Hogan. So if you're in Luger's spot, you're thinking, what if this doesn't work out? What if this doesn't meet their expectations? Could they just go back to Hogan? So why would you want to not get paid extra money and possibly just go back to the person that you're trying to replace? So in retrospect, doesn't seem like a bad move. They highlight the new generation of wrestlers coming up. Diesel, Brett, Razor, Shawn Michaels. Really one of my sweet spots in watching, and kind of a time that we're hitting right around these watch-alongs. They get to Bret Hart at the top. The whole deal with, I believe they cover it. They cover it a little bit later in the screw job section, but, right around the time where they're going to decide to go with Bret. And they talk about Ted Turner and the rise of WCW. I remember this because, a lot of WWF stars leaving for WCW. I remember the creation of Nitro and how
Mhm.
big that felt, at first at least. What did you think of this section right before getting into the creation of Nitro and the Monday Night Wars?
So Bret Hart was my guy. First off, so Bret Hart was a guy I really started to enjoy his tag run with the Anvil later on when they finally won their second world tag title, and then how he kind of slipped into that singles run, was Intercontinental Champion, defeating Perfect, and then he had the great match with Piper at WrestleMania 8, and then Bulldog, and he had his great matches. But guys like Bret in that era didn't really win the world title, so when he finally won the world title and they put that on him, it was such a cool thing for me. It wasn't a great time in business because everything was really down, because I think prior to that, wrestling was really popular, and Hulk Hogan and wrestling and WWF are really synonymous. And Hogan's popularity had dwindled. The steroid trial all, I think, hurt Hogan's popularity. So I don't think that was a good time, necessarily to be champ no matter who was. But I enjoyed it. I think the matches were better. And as a fan of that era, like, you look at Bret's matches, wow, this guy was a hell of a talent. As for Hogan, Savage, and some of the guys that were jumping at that time, right before Nitro, it was interesting because, again, that really helped out WCW from a business standpoint. It really started to propel them. But I remember thinking, like, when I go back and watch that time in WCW, it's not one of my favorite times because I was already kind of tired of that version of Hogan. Randy Savage was kind of doing a similar thing. There was some good stuff in there, but at the same time, I wouldn't say, like, I enjoyed personally 92 a little bit more in WCW. And then I would later on enjoy, when the NWO was really cooking. But that version of WCW was kind of for me.
I remember watching that first episode of Nitro, really enjoying it. Early on, I enjoyed it. As time went on, it just got to wear on me a little bit. But getting into this section with the creation of Nitro and the Monday Night Wars, they start off talking about Vince's handshake deals.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because once upon a time, that might have been a way of doing business. But especially with Vince McMahon working in that company, I wonder how many people knew it going in. But it's like, I don't know if this is a guy I would just necessarily trust on a handshake agreement. Because we hear out of his own mouth in this documentary multiple times how doesn't play fair. He's going to say what he wants. It doesn't necessarily match what he means or what he's thinking. Talks like his dad about getting the match into the ring. So, and I've read about the Vince handshake deal before, and it just seems like such a wild way of doing things. And I think it's why WCW was able to scoop up a lot of business, because there was something on paper to reinforce the deal that you're making.
Yeah, I mean, Hogan even said it. It was like, hitting the lottery again because, we were just getting so much money for so many dates. It's interesting because the narrative, Vince tries to, and, it goes into like kind of next segment where Vince talks about Ted Turner is the guy that he was going up against rather than Eric Bischoff, he likes to say, which is not really the case. Eric was the one making all decisions, but Eric did, have more, and Eric says, I didn't just have a blank check to write. That's a misconception. But obviously, if you look at that time period, Turner was putting more money into WCW, and that led to this big boom, and that led to this creation of WCW Nitro. But it was Eric who was smart enough to get Lex Luger after he had been on a house show the day before and have that big surprise in the Mall of America. And I've loved that Mall of America for the first Nitro, by the way. I wish they had done more shows from there because I thought it was such a unique look. Also, Eric was smart enough to get some of the talent from ECW and AAA and New Japan and, have these different agreements and put these people on a national platform. And so timing was everything, but Eric was really smart to do all that stuff. And I think that's part of what made those early Nitros so great. Like Scott Norton just randomly showing up, I remember too, I think on the second or third Nitro. And also back to that first Nitro with Jushin Liger and Brian Pillman wrestling in that Mall of America. It's just, you never know who was going to show up. There was so much good stuff, and it really helped cause a boom period in wrestling. It caused Vince and the WWF to dig down deep and create new stars. It really started a great talent war that we'll hear about in future episodes in this documentary. But at the end of the day, I think with Vince here, what we're going to talk about here is that Vince, he likes to play the victim a lot. And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but, that's what we're getting at, right? Like, he's going to talk about these people rating his talent. And
he talks about Ted and Eric stealing them. And it's funny because Vince's focus isn't on Eric. It's all about Ted, because Ted's a billionaire and he's got all this money to spend. And it's funny how those perceptions of Ted and Eric get twisted, because everybody called Eric ATM Eric. And it's like, he wouldn't have had the money if Ted Turner wasn't opening it for him. And then you look at Vince McMahon, who's focusing on Ted Turner, thinking he's making all these big decisions. He's the one coming at Vince. And it's like, no, in reality, it was Eric making those decisions And it's just weird how Vince viewed the whole thing, because he might not have necessarily as much money as Turner, but he was close to it. You know, he's competing in that space. And it's funny to see Vince and Bruce's reactions to the WCW digs, because it's like, oh, they were trying to hurt us. They were trying to attack us. And it's like, that was all WCW had to do to be competitive. And we hear this talk throughout this episode about what Vince's idea. Vince felt like WCW was attacking him, whereas WCW was just working to compete. And then when you hear about, they show later in the episode, they get into it about Vince's method of going at the territories, but he felt that was just competing. Where if you talk to the territory people, he did some very dangerous things to really kind of disrupt how they were able to work in their area.
So I would say one thing though, WCW did do that was, it was a little dirty poker, was they would give away results of tape shows. But that being said, who the hell is Vince McMahon to complain about people doing anything? Like you've said, I don't play fair. So it is what it is. And as far as the talent rating, it's the same thing. It's the exact same thing he did with the AWA, the Crockett's, and all these other territories. It's the exact same thing. But like Eric said, he painted it so he could be the sympathetic babyface, that it was billionaire Ted coming after him and doing this. And that's why they created the billionaire Ted skits, which the head of USA had taken off the air because they didn't like it. And she had a friendship with Ted. But I thought it was kind of cool and funny that Ted thought they were funny. He didn't really care about these billionaire Ted skits, which is like the reaction you should have. But
yeah, he almost seemed to take the whole rivalry better between the two of them. He kind of realized that it was, not like pointless, but it was like nothing to get angered and invested about. It's just, this is what we're putting out there. I'm trying to see if I can do better than them. And it's like, look what they did. That's funny. That's a shot back. I can take it.
There was a point where they asked him if he was regretted not hiring Eric Bischoff, knowing he would compete with him. And he basically was like, no, I don't think I have any regrets in my life. But I can see
we're
why
gonna get to that. That happens a little later in this.
Okay.
But
see why he didn't hire Eric. That was not a great audition.
Well, one thing, Vince talking about being angry, and when he's angry, he focuses even more. And that was an interesting little takeaway if you think about what happened later on. But moving on in the order that this goes, they talk about the curtain call, killing kayfabe, and you hear from Vince. He admits he gave his blessing. You get this kind of difference between older and younger wrestlers, how they responded to that curtain call moment, even getting Stephanie's response.
Yeah, that she kind of enjoyed it, thought it was cool, but was also upset and thought it was not great what they were doing with that. It was interesting. Bruce Pritchard obviously hated it, but I think Hunter had a great point that got the best reaction of the night, and maybe we're moving in a different era. And I thought Hunter was really cool about the fact, and even HBK, everybody's always admitted this, that Hunter was the guy that was going to get punished. The other two were leaving. HBK was the champ, and Vince did that. But when you think about that, that's a bunch of bullshit too, right? So we can't punish everybody, so we're just going to punish this one dude.
Well, yeah, it's weird because Bret Hart said it was the unveiling of wrestling going forward. I have a note in my notes here. It's kayfabe, and did it die that day? And I don't know if it died that day, but that was probably the most widespread unveiling of it. Now, they didn't expect it to go out. This got out because of a fan cam, but I mean, this could be the start of a modern era in how we view wrestling, at least if you think about it.
I can see where there's parts of it where it kind of ruins some aspects of it. At the age where a lot of us were when we watched wrestling, we were at that point where we knew it was predetermined. And so when a lot of this stuff came out, it was fucking cool because we were getting a backstage look at something. Right. And give you, I know, but just to kind of compare to something they're doing now. I had this thought recently as we're recording. They did that thing with the fan cam recently where Kevin Owens attacked Cody Rhodes in a parking lot. Right. And the fans covered it. And I thought to myself, pulling this, making a little analogy here with kayfabe, I was like, how cool for a younger fan who still believes in this. And someone's like, well, no, that's not real. And then you go out in a parking lot, it's not, and you see Cody Rhodes and Kevin Owens fight. And I'm like, holy shit, you hooked that fan probably for even longer. And so I can see, going back to this curtain call, where maybe it does ruin it for some people, where it's like, okay.
Now, was that a fan released video, or was that something the WWE released with Kevin Owens and Cody Rhodes?
Nope. that has been labeled everywhere, at least publicly, as fan released videos. I've talked to a few people about it that saw it online, and I know Brian Alvarez and even Post were talking about how well they liked it because they relied on the fans to get it out there, and it was something different.
Because, like, to me, it feels like two different things where it's like that's something the WWF would have wanted to get out.
They
and
did.
the curtain call was kind of something like not necessarily like choreographed by the company.
Right. Oh, I
But
get
it does
it.
show
I mean,
how
it's not
when
supposed
you
to
give
do
it that type of feel, it makes it feel more interesting.
And again, the curtain call, they did have permission. At the end of the day, it is what it is. But I just say I can see where, like Undertaker said, kayfabe. I can see where it kills an aspect of the business for some people. But at the end of the day, I think Hunter was on point. You're kind of moving in a new direction, and you kind of have to figure these things out.
Yeah, and they talk about Vince not being able to kind of stay ahead of things with that. One thing from the last section that I forgot was they went into the discussion of Vince not selling and how he won't sell. Like we've heard it with him getting mad about sneezing, getting mad about being sick. That was just an interesting note we skipped. But moving on from the curtain call, they start talking about Eric Bischoff finally putting his Outsiders debut, the idea of the Outsiders out there. And it's interesting that he had this idea for the Outsiders for a while, didn't have the right wrestlers, and then Hall and Nash debut in WCW, and all of a sudden it's like, these are the guys that are going to look like they're coming from outside the company in. Vince said this was not the right way to do business. This is kind of the section where they really highlight the hypocrisy of Vince feeling rated. And he said Ted wanted to hurt him. He was just trying to compete. And when I heard that, I'm like, well, that just seems like a guy who's twisting the narrative or just doesn't really see it in a more real world way. But maybe that's how Vince views business, is that when he wants to win, he wants to hurt the other guy. And maybe that's why it's banging around in Vince's brain like that.
Hall and Nash had every right to sign contracts. There was nothing wrong with putting them on TV. Now, I will say what's an interesting thing is you're not calling him Diesel. You're not calling him Razor. But if you look at Scott Hall in particular, the presentation was very Razor Ramon-like. So WWE or any company owns the intellectual property of Razor Ramon. But where does that stop and where does that begin? That's always kind of a gray area.
Yeah, because as a person portraying that character, some of your natural habits, tendencies are going to go into it. And it's really that weird thing with WWF contracts, right? Where they could start owning your name or even how you do things, your likeness. We saw with fake Razor and Diesel, they tried making it work for them and it just went over like a lead balloon, which couldn't have felt good for them.
I remember as a kid watching Hall and Nash come in, and I remember thinking before they came in, I'm like, oh, I don't think this is going to work. This is me now in my late teens. Because I remember thinking they have to have a completely different name and look. I remember thinking that. And then when he showed up, I remember like, oh, you can do this?
And that's really part of what made it interesting. And this section contained the quote, "What I say at times is totally different than what I think."
Right.
Which even with what he thought he was trying to say, I don't know how that's necessarily the best sentence to offer up.
No, it's more just Vince.
And he did follow it up with, and I don't think people understand it, which I don't know what different way you can understand that other than the way it sounded.
Yeah. No, they were trying to ask if they thought it was hypocritical, and I thought the people interviewing him did a really good job on that. And then Vince just, he stayed the course. He stayed his opinion and then followed it up with, sometimes what I think and what I say are two different things. Okay. Well, how the fuck do we know what you think? And what this is supposed to be about? What you're supposed to be telling us? It's like this. It doesn't make any sense. Whatever.
Now, is that Vince McMahon the person, or is that a result of being in the wrestling business where everything is so, double-sided, and so you want to portray one thing but you say another? Like, is it the person, or is it the person getting caught up in the business they work in?
I don't know. It's also an older man now too. Maybe he's just everything's running together. Who knows at this point now? But there's no way that statement comes off anything other than hypocritical, like somebody you think is being dishonest with you.
Now, do you think this is one of the episodes that could have made Vince complain about editing tricks and made, Bruce talk about it being a hit piece? Because you're getting into, a little more dangerous territory here. This isn't necessarily scandals. This is how he's handling certain things in the wrestling business.
I mean, it could have been. I never really saw any of this as a hit piece. Like everything leading into episode 6, this is all stuff that, we figured out. And I mean, as far as, he could say it's tricks with editing, but I mean, I don't know. It didn't look like it to me, but maybe we'll see if that Kevin Dunn, Vince McMahon documentary reply ever comes out.
That would be interesting. And, we move from that section to they're talking about Hogan turning heel, WCW winning for 83 weeks. Vince couldn't fathom a heel Hogan. Whenever he saw Hogan, he saw him as that American babyface, which kind of checks out with how Vince always handled him.
One of the wrestling historians on this, the gentleman who's bald, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I believe it's Matthew Shoemaker.
Yeah, it is Shoemaker. Thank you. He had said that he thought Vince really missed the opportunity to turn Hogan heel prior to this. And that's one of his big probably losses there. He didn't turn Hogan heel before this. But I don't know. I was looking at that when he said that, and I was like, I don't know if it would have worked as well. I feel like the thing that really worked about this Hogan heel turn was the timing of it all. The fact that he was in this other company, the fact that it was Scott Hall and Kevin Nash looking like they were coming over from WWF, and the fact that we were in this boom tire period of wrestling. If Hogan had turned heel, like after the steroid trial and came back, it would have been to a much smaller audience. And I don't know if it would have had the same impact.
It's hard to say because knowing WWF sensibilities, it probably would have been like a little more cartoonish of a heel and wouldn't have hit like this. Like what was weird about, not what was weird, but what was timely about this is you had Hogan joining the company. You had Hall and Nash doing this big thing as the outsiders. Then there was that big thing with the third man. And when they unveil Hogan as the third man, dropping the leg on Randy Savage, the response you got from the crowd, that felt like the perfect way of doing it. It showed that if you can turn Hogan the right way, it's going to be major for business. And then you've also got Eric Bischoff's outsiders idea morphing into the NWO idea. And it's almost like how great ideas happen, where you start with what you want to do, you put it into practice, and then you just go with what works. And it became one of the biggest things in the business.
Can't argue.
You also had Bischoff's WWF audition was hired here, and how Vince didn't regret not hiring him and doesn't regret anything in his life, which another wild statement because your average person's going to regret something. This was an interesting discussion of all that.
I can see why he didn't regret hiring Eric, though, at the time. I mean, Eric has admitted that was not a great audition. So at the time, there was no way to tell that this guy was going to end up being like this pivotal role in this company that was going to almost put you out of business and challenge you more than any other company in the history of your business. There's no way you were going to know that. But it's kind of ironic that all happened.
Definitely. Now we're getting into the final real section of this because they end on kind of like a preview of the next episode. But with this, you've got the Brett deal and the whole discussion of the Montreal screw job. If you know wrestling, you know what it is. So we're not going to jump too much into screw job talk. But it was interesting, Shane kind of talking about how Vince showed Brett what he could do to get out of his contract. Like somehow that made it better what was happening. It was weird that there was no discussion of the creative control. You got to notice that Vince saw the problems with Brett and Sean bubbling, and instead of thinking it was a problem, he just thought this was great television. You got Brett fixing the sharpshooter, the infamous sharpshooter that Shawn Michaels is trying to put him in. It's one of those purely Bret Hart moments. What did you think about this segment? I really was touched by Brett getting choked up about talking about Owen.
Owen, with a lot of kind words and helping him that wasn't right. And Owen was a real calming influence to him. These guys screwed you over and that shouldn't have happened. It was interesting to see the sympathy Brett was getting from the people in the company, like Undertaker, and well-deserved, and understandably. Brett was one of the hardest workers there. He had done so much for them at that time. For him to lose that title, and it doesn't get discussed, that Brett has said he just didn't want to lose the title to Shawn Michaels, and he didn't want to use him to Montreal. He would have been willing to lose it to other people. And the reason was because Shawn said he wouldn't have done the same for him. He wouldn't have gave him the same respect. And Brett had creative control. And none of that stuff was discussed on that part of the documentary. So a little bit of a miss there, I would say. But hey, it is what it is. They did what they did. We all know it by now, but I do find it interesting. Some of the stuff that comes out in the aftermath here with the fight in the locker room, where Brett punches him. I do find it interesting that, Vince always said he was going to give them a free shot. And Brett's like, I don't know where that shit comes from. We locked up, And then I know it's been disputed that Brett couldn't have gave him an uppercut because it hit Vince's temple, But then again, I don't know if Vince landed, but whatever the case is, it seems like the exact thing of what happened that day, nobody knows really for sure. And it's kind of been lost in the storytelling of all of this. We do know Brett hit Vince, though. That seems to be apparent.
My favorite part of it was when Brett's confronted with Vince's story. He makes it sound like that version of things is ridiculous and could never happen. Like, why would we do that? We locked up like it was a wrestling match. And it's like, all right, like, I like you, Brett, but like, that's where credibility slumped for me, because I had always heard it described as an uppercut, and then like the temple thing. But it's just funny how like over time different people's stories change, and I'm not faulting Brett for that, because he's had a lot of health issues.
Yeah, it's also it was a wild day for both of them. So who knows? At the end of the day, we know Bret Hart hit Vince. How we got to there, I don't know. I do like Brett's story though.
Yep. And the last note, it was a great story, great wrestling lore. The last note I've got from this episode is Vince is always going to do what's best for business. And then we go into another one of those quick montages where they talk about the creation of the Mr. McMahon character. So, we're halfway through the series now, having watched it once and then rewatched it again for each episode. Halfway through the series, how are you feeling about it at this part?
I'm really glad we're rewatching it, because there's stuff is sticking more now. It kind of all blurred together. So getting to rewatch this individually and then look back, it's a much more fascinating look at it. I just feel like stuff's sinking in a little bit better, and because it's a lot to digest. Even though if you know everything, sometimes it's a lot to digest, because this is just a crazy ride that we've been a part of, because we've been fans for so long that we've watched all this, and it's something else to have it unfold, like with the rest of the world to see.
Yeah, it's definitely one thing binging this series all at one time and then going back and watching it in separate episodes, because when you get to watch it separately and take in what's said each time, the crazy little things come out. The discrepancies in stories are wild, seeing how things are different from what you believed in wrestling history. So it's been a great time. And we are going to continue on next week with episode 4 of the Mr. McMahon Netflix documentary. And if it was one thing that this documentary was missing, it was a little Game Up Hard Hydration. If you haven't tried Game Up, then you are missing out. Imagine your favorite seltzer and your favorite sports drink had a baby, but it's way better than that. Each can is 110 calories, low carb, 4.9 ABV. It's a nice light drink that is not light on flavor. Game Up comes in fruit punch, orange, lemon, lime, and grape. Pick it up at drinkgameup.com or at your nearest liquor store.